Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. You're listening to the Just Thinking Show, brought to you by the Islamic Vibes podcast, and I'm your host, Majid. If you find this content beneficial, then please share it with your family and friends. And goes without saying, please don't forget to subscribe and follow the Islamic Vibes podcast. Okay, so today, on today's show, I'm joined by my co-hosts, Rash, Affy, and brother Ishti. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, my brothers.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, bro.
Our first podcast in 2022, guys. How's things been going with yourselves? New year, new selves, new resolutions. What's happening?
Something like that. You guys need to tell me the best way to, when a Muslim sends you a New Year greeting, how do you respond back?
Yeah, you know what? It's funny because with my kids sometimes, like when they'll just say something like New Year's, and I'll say, well, at this time, this is happening in Syria and Gaza. They're like, yo, man, why are you so serious for? You know what I mean? So I think you have to, it depends on who you're speaking to, really. But I mean, it's just, I guess it's for Muslims, it's just another day. If anyone's going to be, if anything in reality, it's another day, another year that's chalked off your ajal. If you want to, and if you want to count it as a year, because it's still a year, isn't it? If you're doing it from January to January. But yeah, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I've not had many messages, in all honesty. And I remember a time when on New Year's, when it used to hit the 12 o'clock, all the networks used to jam and you never used to get your text message. I remember the days, and now I think only some family members sent a New Year's message. So maybe they've got the point after all these years, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
But I don't know.
I think, when I work, everyone starts off an email at the start of the year with Happy New Year. So
yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's, Islamically, we know that we have our Islamic calendar. But even then, I don't think there's such a concept of a Happy New Year, even from when it gets to, when it gets to Muharram, it's strange because that's the first month of the Islamic calendar. And in all honesty, for a lot of Muslims out there, it's the saddest, right? So even from an Islamic point of view, because obviously, some people with the Muharram and the issue of Imam Hussein, radiallahu anhu. So I don't know, man. For us, is it even a concept? So yeah, I don't really get into that stuff.
Yeah, I just try and avoid it. Yeah, I've been talking to my daughters and stuff about some of the pagan roots of it and stuff like that. So I think it's just an opportunity to kind of highlight that. But the only reason I asked was sometimes you don't want to get into this lengthy debate on WhatsApp as to why you shouldn't be greeting, using a New Year's greeting, and things like that. But anyway, just wondered what you guys had done.
Well, I've not, like if people said to me, Happy New Year's, I'd said, yeah, man, all good type of thing. So I've not really wished it back as such.
Yeah.
So, but it's a bit easier now, because you work from home anyway.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, inshallah, let's, hopefully this is going to be a good year. Well, from a Gregorian point of view for the podcast and so on. We, hopefully it's a jam-packed year. We have Ramadan approaching fast, rapid. So hopefully we'll keep everyone, interested, and hopefully our content will benefit people. Just make a dua for that. You know what I mean? So cool. Let's kick on then, inshallah ta'ala, with today's topic. So in today's episode, right, we'll be speaking about the concept of freedom. Now, it's actually quite odd how I arrived at this topic, to be honest with you, right? Because as Rash knows, we want to speak about a topic which for weeks now we've been trying to bring in, to do with conversion therapy, which I'm sure we're going to speak quite a bit about, inshallah ta'ala. Then also we had the issue of Tony Blair being given a knighthood, or rather, shall we say, becoming a knight companion of the most noble order of the Garter, and the backlash that that's received. I think 600,000 petitions. People have signed a petition to sort of get them to remove this title. But, you know, the thing is in both these cases, the concept of freedom plays a huge role, massive role, right? Whether it's like the freedom to choose how to live your life, you know, whether to choose what gender you are, or, you know, how you want to conduct yourself, or the issue of being content with, you know, the deaths of millions of people in the name of freedom. Okay, so we see that even these stories, they have a link to freedom. And then on top of that, I was chatting to Affy, and you know, he's a big man on movies, and he mentioned to me that he came across an interesting quote from a movie, right? Now I'm sure, like, you're wondering which sophisticated movie this was, but you know what? It was the Avengers. Okay, and in the movie, Loki, who's the bad guy, if people watch Avengers, right? He tells I can't remember the guy. I mean, you know the guy with the patch. Who's the guy with the patch? The leader of the Avengers. What's that guy's name?
Samuel L. Jackson.
Well, not Samuel L. Jackson, but the character. Anyway, doesn't matter. But he tells one of the guys that basically he tells him that he's come to save people, and basically he asks from what, and Loki says freedom. So basically, what he was saying is that he's come to save mankind from the enslavement of freedom. Now, I found this really interesting, right? So that's why I thought, inshallah ta'ala, I get my my brothers on the podcast, and we can discuss the concept of freedom. We can ask the question, you know, and try to answer it. Is mankind enslaved to freedom? And even we can ask the question and address, does freedom actually exist? So actually, you know what? On that note, let me bring you guys in, inshallah ta'ala, right? And let's open up the discussion with the question, does freedom exist? Ishti, my bro, I'm going to start off with you, man. What's your thoughts?
First thing, it seems like I was left out of all these conversations you've been having. So, yeah. So I thought I'd bring that up.
Don't worry, you weren't the only one.
But I think, you know, before we start talking about freedom, it's worth actually just visiting what freedom actually means. Now, I did a quick Google search just to find out what the definition is, and it's like a linguistic definition that comes up, like the power or right to act, to speak freely, and to do whatever you want in essence, or the state of not being impoverished or enslaved. But then in reality, when people use it, like politicians, they actually mean it in a very ideological sense. They don't mean it in the just linguistic sense. What they refer to is the freedom to, there's defined freedoms. And we've spoken about this in the past when during the Enlightenment, the thinkers thought about what are these freedoms? What is it that man needs to be free? And they decided that there were several, but the most well-known are the freedom of worship, expression, freedom from fear, and freedom of want. And these are what Franklin Roosevelt built the UN on. And this is what is meant by freedom. When people say we want freedoms, our freedoms, that's what they're asking for. They want the freedom to be able to choose their leaders. They're wanting the freedom to do and express themselves in whatever manner they wish to do. And this is in objection to the oppression of the state, because the state is seen as something that controls people and limits their actions through the laws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So, I mean, if you look at, just to build on that issue, if you look at the sort of struggle between the church and the thinkers and philosophers, we see that when they arrived at their emotional compromise, shall we say, that, you know, religion has no part to play in the state or in life. One of the big issues was that in Christianity, you had the concept of the original sin, i.e. basically people were born with the sin, and for them to get to paradise and to get salvation, it was through the church. So in a way, they monopolized this. However, the thinkers said, well, you know, in reality, man is not born with sin. In fact, man has the ability to do good. When he does evil, when his freedoms are limited and they are infringed upon. Hence why, like you said, when they spoke about the government and the rule of law, this is mainly there to sort of protect and make sure that people's freedoms are not infringed upon. So that's the sort of definition of freedom. But the question I asked was, does freedom exist? What do you guys think? Does freedom exist? Or do we need to qualify that?
No, we can qualify it because, like you say, you know, until you define something, you can't necessarily say if it exists or not. So based on what Ishti said, defining it as, you know, those some elements of, say, personal freedom, then you can say a type of freedom exists, because being able to choose your own decisions, do what you want to do, what you want to eat, what you want to wear, what you want to believe, what you want to own, to an extent, you go, if you're free to do those things, there's an element of freedom. But then if someone says, is there a limitless supply of freedom? You know, are you free to do absolutely anything without any restriction whatsoever? Then absolutely there isn't, because at some point what happens is your freedom is going to impinge on someone else's freedom. What you want is not going to be suitable for somebody else. And when there's that conflict, you're not free anymore. You know, you're not free to go walk into a shop and just take whatever you want. You're not free to walk up to anybody and, you know, harass them or touch them or do something to them. You know, that's why that limitless, undeterred kind of freedom doesn't exist at all. What, from the point of view of the church, and what from the point of view of previously, and maybe even theologically, is what they try to do is go, okay, there are certain things you can do. And from a theological point of view, you have, you know, and I'm not even saying Islam here, even just generally different religions, they said, you know, there's certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. Therefore, you know, you have lots of restrictions. Even in that, there's probably some freedoms, because you could say being able to choose to eat chicken instead of beef, you're free to choose, aren't you? So that's why I think the question probably does need a bit of qualification, because we do have certain freedoms, even regardless of religion.
Yeah, I mean, Affy, I'll bring you to this, inshallah ta'ala. You know, a quick question is, what the guys have said is bang on, However, do you think that the way people understand freedom, the normal people, and the way maybe Ishi's explained it and the way Rash has explained it, there's a disconnection, in the sense like when you speak to people, it's almost as if they are free to be able to do what they want to do.
Yeah, and maybe there's a confusion amongst people on free will as opposed to this concept of freedom. So I think, you know, when I think it was Ishti was talking about when, and you touched on how, you know, secularism emerged to try and break that hold that the church had upon people. And, you know, it was like they were being forced in order to, or coerced into behaving in a certain way by dangling the carrot of heaven, and this is what God has ordained for you in front of people. And therefore you try and break them from the shackles that the church had on people. And therefore you tell them you are now free because we're going to protect these freedoms of yours. And I think that's the subject that we're having. Whereas I think in the minds of people, when they see, and this is part of the propaganda, I guess, when they're showing regimes throughout the world where there's true dictatorship in the way the majority of the world understands it, and then they say, well, you know, you're forced, you can't do anything, that it's a police state, they've got a spotlight on everything you're doing, whereas actually, look at here, we haven't got this kind of life here, and therefore this is free. So I do think there's a perception of freedom that people propagate, but I would question how many people have actually understood this concept that they're propagating, that they believe they're protecting and that they want everyone else to share, but how much of them actually do believe it, which is, I think, probably what you're getting at there.
Yeah, no, of course. And the thing is, as well, is because we know that we can see, I mean, we witnessed it, some of us are kind of old enough to have seen a big change in society and the way people think. From maybe very early on, society was maybe influenced by certain Christian principles. However, this concept of freedom, as now with technology, with the internet, with social media, what we're seeing now is an idea where people have not really understood it in that way. They really do believe that there can be nothing that stops you from doing what you want. And there's many examples, isn't there? People feel now, for example, that they are free to, believe that they are actually a totally different gender, right? It's weird, but people feel free that they can just commit suicide because it's their life, their body, they can do anything to it, right? And what we're seeing at the same time, though, is you're seeing that the sort of moral fabrics of the society, are breaking. And, and some people say that, society is on a decline, like a nosedive, right? At that pace, because of this concept that people think they can do what they want, they can do to whom they want, even though within the whole discussion, you have something like the harm principle. And I think that was what Ishti was trying to explain earlier, that, there is a principle. And even though this was disputed, and there was no real one school of thought, in the sense like you're free to do what you want until you harm somebody else. But then there were some thinkers that were saying that even then that's a restriction. Some people were against that because they couldn't sort of come to the conclusion that, because freedom really means you're free, isn't it? I mean, if you really think about it and maybe that's why there's this confusion, because some people are saying you're free to do what you want, and some people are saying, yeah, you're free to do what you want, but then there's these restrictions, and to some that, well, that's not actual freedom. But Ishti, I think you got someone in your mind, bro. I'll bring you into this.
Interestingly, I didn't think I was going to speak about this on this discussion, but I think one of the major sort of frictions within this society, and in society, from what I understand abroad as well, is that the cost of freedom is what causes the friction, right? So you feel like you're free as much as you're possible, right? But the freest person before, 50 years ago, was the white man, right? And I mean literally white man, because he could do a lot more. But as his freedoms have been eroded by having to give the white female more space, because she's now coming to the workspace, he feels conflicted. Now he sees all these immigrants taking his space, but that's because the cost of freedom comes at the cost of another's freedom or your own freedom, right? And there is no limit to this, because it's that perception, and this is what is breeding racism, nationalism. And this is, even if you look at women's sport, right? And this is it's really funny when I hear about, like there's a transgender swimmer that can beat all these like women, like he sort of trounces I don't know the right word. He trounces all the records. How are women meant to feel? They're going to feel sort of, they've worked as hard as physically possible. They were at the pinnacle of their sport, and now someone who wasn't good as a male, or quite good as a male, and absolutely decimates the females. What can you do? And this is the problem. Yes, there is a freedom, but they forget what the cost of freedom is. There has to be a loser in this game.
Yeah, subhanAllah. So I mean, that leads me to another thought then, Ishti, that the people that have come across with this type of philosophy, obviously it's from humans who are limited in all capabilities, right? So we have this philosophy that has sort of emerged, then it even sort of compromised, because even when there was the split between the church and the state, when the thinkers and the philosophers won, there were many from the thinkers who wanted to actually outrightly ban religion, but there was a compromise that you can't just ban it, right? So then the question is that, are humans capable of sort of establishing a sound system which all humans can live according to? And what I say here is, I deliberately use the word sound and not just system, because system they surely can, but a sound system, a correct system. What do you think, Rash?
Yeah, that does lead into an interesting kind of philosophical kind of question. And it doesn't need to be philosophical, but that's what they kind of made it into. You can actually discuss these things quite rationally. What they tried to do is go, well, we've got these issues. the churches kind of oppressing the people. You know, we feel that our freedoms are being restricted, and therefore they looked at different aspects of what the human being requires and tried to satisfy them. And you're right to use the word sound, because what they did is they satisfied them to an extent with some systems, but because they haven't satisfied them with the right or the sound systems, we see the debauchery, the corruption, the decay of modern society. So to give that a little bit more background, is they recognized a human being needs to have the freedom to believe whatever they want to believe, be that in a religion, but also be that not a religion, so atheism, agnosticism, religions, etc. So that's where they introduced the concept of freedom of belief. You know, you can believe whatever you want, but with that came the ability to apostatize from one belief to another. Mm-hmm. So it just opened the door for this, you know, you believe whatever you want to believe. And we can maybe, without me going into all of it, we can probably discuss each one of these that I'm going to mention and then maybe elaborate on them. So they considered the freedom of belief. They also recognized that, you know, people want to be able to, you know, as Affy was saying about free will, part of the free will is also to be able to speak what's on your mind. So they introduced kind of the concept of, well, why can't you speak against certain people? Why can't you speak against the church? Why can't you speak against rulers? So they introduced this concept of freedom of expression. So again, that allowed people to think, you know what, now in the past, I wasn't able to speak out against someone because they were the ruler. All of a sudden, now I can. So all of a sudden, it felt like mankind had somewhat progressed, because look, we can speak out against people rather than previously. Maybe we had to, you know, there was limits to what we could say. And again, we know we can talk about this one in more detail because there's restrictions on this. Then they equally recognize that a human being, our species, has a natural tendency to want to own, to want to collate, be it land, be it a shelter, you know, a house over your head, be it clothes, whatever it is. We have a natural innate instinct to want to own. So therefore, okay, on that basis, and this links to Ishti's point as well, that, you know, we want a freedom of ownership. But like you said, like the white man had that freedom before, and then the woman didn't have that freedom, even in Western society, less than 100 years ago. Prior to that, you know, women weren't allowed to vote, women weren't allowed to own land, all of these things. But the idea was, now there's a freedom of ownership. And again, it sounds good. It means that it sounds like you're progressing as a civilization, but actually when you dig deeper, and I'm sure we will do, then I think there's some caveats to that. And then I would say maybe the last one is what we'd class more as like a personal freedom. And I think we've touched on that one as well, which is kind of, you know, this whole LGBT movement, you know, even being, this is probably the extreme of it. It started off more as a, you know, just being able to do what you want to do in your own homes. You know, in your private space, you can do whatever you want, as long as maybe, like you said, Madge, that harm principle, as long as that's not impinged, you can do whatever you want in your home. That's your personal freedom. But then that gradually moved towards, you know, homosexuality, pedophilia, all of these things. Even though things like pedophilia might, you know, legally you're not allowed to enact it, people are allowed to openly go, you know, I've got these issues, or this person's got these feelings, blah, 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 and made to be somewhat normalized. So I think these are the four freedoms that man, when they tried to come up with a set of systems, said we need to somehow satisfy these and then come up with a system, and then people will feel liberated. And I think that has happened, because that's what Western civilization has taken us towards. But now, in the last 50, 100 years, or however many years of these freedoms being given, we are now seeing the limited capacity of man to come up with systems, because all of those four freedoms, I think you can all comment on, or each one of them has actually proven to be detrimental to how human beings live. So maybe that, if people want to add to each of those and maybe express a bit more, I didn't want to make my point too long. I think that would be worth kind of maybe delving into, if you think that's a good idea.
I think Affy, you want to say something?
I wanted to just build upon what Rash said and actually pose a question back to him, if that's all right. Just not to take your job away from you, but just because Rash made the point. On paper, it sounds like a really good idea, right? Especially when you see what the situation was like with the monopoly, the church, and then the king who used, or the royalty who used the church to their advantage. But what has actually happened since then, you've got those people who were the thinkers in society, who were slightly ahead in their understanding and therefore capitalized on this, especially the freedom of ownership, took control of the resources that made them rich, had the means of production, became richer, and actually became the most powerful group of people within society. So what's actually happened is that the state was replaced, or has been, and you can see this in the West, the state has been replaced by the dictatorship of the king to the dictatorship of these people who have got the power, the rich people who then control law and legislation to their advantage, which protects them, bring in legislation that's going to make them richer, but also bring in laws that prevents anyone else from reaching that status to take that position away from them. So although, yeah, you're right, on paper it sounds good and it's appealing, what's happened over time is that it's been manipulated and the definition has evolved. And you get the definition of freedom that's different for liberals and for conservatives. And you ultimately see always it'll be the conservatives who retain the grip on power to make sure that the current status quo doesn't change.
Yeah. I didn't see the question there as a banging point.
But that was the question that, actually, have you found that this is what it's actually ended up becoming?
But then what I want to add to that, Rash, and then you can, it's up to you if you want to answer this first, is from what you're saying there, and you're right, in reality, things did change. You had the barons and the kings and whatnot, and they became the capitalists and the people with the money. And in reality, one could argue that, yes, people had more access to the wealth, the land, i.e. what people used to be, who were called peasants. But in reality, this economic interaction that even they had after these freedoms benefited those at the top anyway, right? So some people argue that the peasants, we're still peasants today, right? Some people say that. So the question that I posed at the beginning as well, probably is a good time to bring this in. The fact that, is man enslaved to freedom? Because what we're seeing is this philosophy and this way of life, right? It didn't come from the creator. It came from certain people, right? And then other people carried it forward. And if we can see the fact that from all of this, the people who benefited from the old feudal system somehow still benefit, their lineage still benefits from this new system, right? And if we look around us and we see how, our families, how they are consumed by the dunya, the whims and desires and all these things, we see this, right? And this concept of freedom, of materialism, and then some people go to other extreme of liberalism and so on, that, people have become enslaved where, it's certain people, there's a few people who dictate what's fashionable, what isn't, what's in, what's out, right? What's trending, what isn't. And people, like cattle, like sheep, just go with the flow, right? They don't use their own mind, they just go with it. And that's why, there's a saying, I can't remember the guy's name, is it George Orwell? Rash? He said, freedom is slavery. Yeah. Right? So, yeah. Right? Because he was talking about that the masses are not educated, right? And they will just be used as slaves without even realizing it. Because before, maybe there was agitation with the peasants, thinking, why is it that the king is the king because God made him a king, and we can't question no matter how tyrannical he is, right? And God made us a peasant, so that's just how we're going to stay. And then the church, they're just getting richer, right? And our salvation is through them. Maybe they had an issue to be sad about and angry about, and then things changed. Now people do feel like they have this freedom, right? What's actually changed? Still, people are being manipulated. So the question of, is mankind enslaved to freedom? You know, I would say that yes, this concept of freedom that we're talking about, not issue of free will and so on, freedom, i.e. the Western philosophy of freedom, certainly the whole world is enslaved to it right now. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, well, you can just take one of them. I'm trying not to do all of them, but just take one. Just take freedom of ownership. It's quite interesting because like you gave the example of the peasants, because they weren't allowed to own, it genuinely oppressed that instinct of man where they want to be able to, and instinct's not the right word, but it's easy for people to understand, isn't it? In that man wants to own things.
Desire to own.
Even as a bare minimum, wants to own the land that they live on and the house that they, live in and things like that. So when they first gave them that freedom of ownership, that did take them away from that oppression. Okay, so that element of it is okay. But when you say freedom, and this is where I agree with you in that when we say enslaved by freedom, that's completely correct when it comes to ownership, because what they did is they had this limitless freedom, which meant people could own absolutely anything. That resulted in the privatization of everything and anything, be it gas, oil, water, land, everything. All of a sudden, what happened is what we see today in 2022 is the gap between the rich and the poor. Rather than the freedoms having caused that gap to get smaller, the freedoms have actually made that gap get bigger. Why? If that solution was the right solution, wouldn't that have distributed the wealth more correctly? It was flawed from the start, because by giving this unlimited freedom, it meant that the rich were able just to, like, say, privatize the gas, oil, land, own all of that. The kings, queens, lords, and people still own swathes of land across the UK, for instance, don't pay taxes on them. What did it allow? It allowed people to hoard those things that the poor people could have used. So freedom of ownership in itself has enslaved people, rather than initially you think about it and go, wait there, that's a good thing because we're now allowing the peasants to own. You then bring Islam into it and you go, actually, Islam gave Muslims and human beings the ability to own land far before all of this enlightenment. But it will also put those restrictions in place correctly to make sure things like natural resources aren't owned by people, because it recognized that will lead to this wealth inequality. Instead, those things are owned by everyone in terms of they're public owned, and that's what created a more fair and just society. Whereas these Western freedoms actually destroyed society, and to this day is making it worse. And that's just one of those freedoms, and you can do that with all of them.
Yeah, subhanAllah, man. No, on point. Ishti, sorry, you wanted to make a point, bro.
I was gonna give a smaller example there, and it was to do with women's liberation. They had the freedom to go into the workplace, which they had been denied. Now, it sounds like a good idea, and in answering your question, it was in relation to do with your earlier question: does freedom enslave? Now, obviously, women can work in Islam; they can work in Western societies, right? The problem is, as women started to work, right, what started to happen is they got involved with the workplace. They started 9-to-5 jobs. Who suffered? They became enslaved to the workplace, and children, motherhood. The idea of family raising children became in decline. The idea of independence of women and becoming divorce becoming more frequent has started, obviously plummeted. So the whole notion of freedom has caused this incredible problem. Whereas Islam gives this prestige, or this idea of the motherhood being an honorific position, and it gives this idea that the man, as the husband, is the one who provides. The woman can work if she like, but they are given roles so that the family unit is more cohesive. And I think a lot of this is because they learn, so that the philosophers have taught these ideas, but they're not all knowing. They only learn from history, from their experiences. So, for example, they see this repression, or women are feeling repressed. okay, let them work to a certain extent, but don't lose out the value of the family. With the ownership thing, yeah, you should be able to own, but it's because they don't have that foresight, that sort of total knowledge, that they keep falling into these traps. And I think that's the ultimate limitation. So they can never have true freedom because they never know the sort of what's going to happen based on these decisions. So yeah, they are enslaved, but they never know.
Yeah,
until it happens.
I think that obviously comes down what you mentioned there about and actually what Rash spoke about, the examples of Islam, how just those two small examples you gave, how Islam provides a different type of solution. And what it really boils down to, as we know, the fact that, linked to another point that I made earlier, that this is something which humans have produced. This is something which they've produced. And the reality is that, probably Ishti probably knows more about exactly who it was within the intellectual and philosopher movement, but it wasn't peasants. These people themselves are very well off, right? So the actual sincerity of the actual movement, Allahu Alam, I don't know. But nevertheless, what we can see is that man himself, he cannot establish right and wrong, right, good and evil, as a sound guidance for mankind. We know this because from freedom, we see that, if you look at the fact that if you imagine now a jungle, it is really the survival of the fittest. Because if humans are going to decide what's right and wrong, then they're going to be biased. They're going to choose their own clan. And you see racism and nationalism, these sort of things that come out of this, right? Whilst Islam is from the creator. So, as Rash mentioned, some of the things that were groundbreaking in Western Europe, i.e. women owning land and stuff like this, 1400 years ago, right? This was very normal. However, because of the propaganda machine, many people don't know this, okay? For example, the first university in the Muslim lands was opened by a Muslim scholar, woman. She was a woman, right? So university, right? So nowadays, the news is sort of like consumed with reports like, is the Taliban going to let girls go to school? What does this do? This forms a sort of opinion that Islam is depriving women of freedom of education, right? However, if people did a bit more research, they'll find out that this is not the case. Very early on, Aisha radiallahu anha, she was a scholar, right? And she was the wife of the Messenger of Allah. Okay, so we can see that the problem here is that this is due to the fact that it's man deciding what's right and wrong. And Rash, I want to just bring you in on this point. And we said it's good to give some examples, right? And one of the ones that we've been wanting to speak about was the proposed ban to the conversion therapy. Okay, and I know you did a bit of research about this. So just explain, just to illustrate where this freedom has really confused the people to a certain degree.
Yeah, so to give it context, it comes under the personal freedom. So one of the personal freedoms under the Western kind of civilization is this idea. It started off more as just what you want to do in your homes and your personal lives, but it kind of evolved into the modern day. We see it as being choosing your own gender, choosing your sexuality. Yeah, so that's the modern incarnation of the personal freedom. And as part of that, over time, and over even the last 10 years, we've clearly seen, even media and everything promote more that this idea of choosing your own sexuality. People either identifying as different sexualities, or even people going, well, I want to be one sexuality one day and I want to be another sexuality another day, all this kind of crazy stuff, as well as completely choosing your own gender, as if there's more than two genders, all of this kind of idea. So where conversion therapy comes in, conversion therapy has existed for a very long time. It's even existed, it's kind of, the reason it's got such a bad name, it's the idea that in the earlier times, under like Christianity and stuff, when someone said that they were gay, or that they had feelings for a man had feelings for another man, they would send them off to these camps. And in these camps, they would do all sorts of things, beat them, kind of, they would basically, there's some funny ways. It's not a funny topic, but you know what I mean? The people came out with some really dodgy stuff like, let's beat the gay out of this person and all of these kind of things, whether it's medication, whether it's beats, all of these things. So clearly it's got a bad name because it was done in a very physical way. It was as if you could do something to change someone as to what they're attracted to. So that idea, that concept is called conversion therapy. In more kind of civilized way, they highlight conversion therapy as like, if someone has the freedom to, you know, choose their sexual orientation, but they're struggling with it. Because, for instance, in the past, being gay meant you got bullied at school and things like that. So it was natural for the doctor or someone to advise that, okay, certainly in some states in America and some places in the world, go to so-and-so and, you know, via discussion, they'll be able to convert you back to being straight. So the whole conversion back to being straight was, and I don't mean that, but you know what I mean? The whole conversion process is about, you know, getting someone to be normal versus someone being identify as something else. So what the government are pushing quite heavily now, and they've pushed out this idea that they're gonna ban this, and they've asked for people's input on it before they make it law. However, if you read about it, they've already decided this is going to be law. It's not a case of people are now going to be able to come forward and say, we don't want this to be banned. Oh, sorry, this can't be banned. They're saying it's going to be banned, but we just want to hear people's opinions on it. And where this conflicts for us, and again, you know, for you guys to comment on where this conflicts is anybody even having a discussion with someone to try and convince them that, say from an Islamic point of view, you know, say you went to an imam, say someone in this society where being homosexual is, you know, promoted, not just a fringe thing, it's highlighted on media and things like that. It's quite popular and what's the word? Not savvy. It's quite trendy nowadays to be gay. It's crazy, but it's quite trendy to be gay nowadays. So if that person feels in this society that, you know, for whatever reason, you know, I'm not comfortable, even though nowadays it's made easier, them going to an imam and an imam speaking to them and going, look, how this is not allowed in Islam and all the things, and having that discussion with them, that's almost classified, or that would be classified as conversion therapy. And they want to ban that. So all of a sudden in our safe spaces, even in these kind of societies, they're saying that the mother and the father isn't included in this. So if you were just to speak to your children and your son or your daughter came to you and said, look, you know, I've got these tendencies, what shall I do? You to try and persuade them to be straight, they would class as conversion therapy. However, in the framework of family, they're not saying they're going to ban that, but it's a stepping stone towards that. If it becomes mainstream, that this whole idea of even deterring someone away from homosexuality is actually illegal, then all of a sudden, over time, we can see where it's going to lead to.
Yeah. And that itself, if you think about it, like Rash said, when we're talking about the idea of the personal freedoms, for someone to speak to someone else, whether it's an imam or whether it's a priest, well, I don't think priest is going to be doing that now because they're on the next flex, but in regards to like just speaking to people, then this is a criminal act. And from what I read, it can be punishable by prison.
Yeah.
Right. So again,
just to interrupt a really super short point, like you say, prison, you know how most of our mosques are charity registered. One of the things is if they find, you know, anybody doing any type of charity, their charity status will be revoked.
Yeah.
So that's how it directly links in with the likes of mosques and things like that as well. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I mean, the issue we're speaking about here is freedoms. Now, that in itself, the fact that for someone to speak to another person, it's not like you said the old school methods someone just to speak to someone now could be criminalized. Again, this is a contradiction. How can you enforce a law for someone just to be speaking? And again, I mean, you know, it'd be well, they'll probably say it would apply anyway. But if there was a someone who was gay and somebody was speaking to him and telling him to become straight, you know, would that apply? Would it not? You know, I don't know, because right now it just seems as if, like you said, it's not just savvy. It's like it's becoming in the mindset of the TV adverts and the way it's being promoted, is becoming very normal now. Okay, so that again, like you said, the personal freedoms, okay, where someone can decide and needs their guidance. Now it seems as if, yes, it's allowed for you to speak to someone to promote this particular viewpoint, but you're not allowed to speak to the person who's going to promote a different type of viewpoint. Again, where's the freedom in that? Another point,
completely hypocritical.
It's hypocritical. And also, if you think about, you know, mentioned the harm principle, and there was something interesting in what John Stuart Mill, basically what he articulated in the book on liberty. He said that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. But we've already spoken about the harm principle. But what I want to just point out to you here, it says that it uses the term civilized community, right? So in a way, it's like as if, yes, what he's saying is applied only to civilized communities. If there's somebody else who they probably see as barbaric or uncivilized, then these freedoms don't apply to them. And if you think about historically, what the colonialists have done in places like Africa, in the Muslim lands, with this mindset of going to civilize the barbarians, okay, they've treated them in a subhuman way. However, it's like as if those rules, the freedoms that, just say, the white man of Europe is privileged to, right? They're not. So it's very selective who this freedom applies to. So it's not even a universal concept. And if we then think about right now the sort of ideological attack on Islam, where basically what we're seeing now, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in France, in Austria, I think a brother shared, you guys might have seen, a brother shared this post on one of the groups that we're on, where across Europe, all these government actions that were against Muslims, right, and Islam, basically where they're clamping down on things that really should come into the category of personal freedoms from their point of view. The way the women dress, what they believe, even some places, how they sacrifice their meat, right? We see what's happening in France. We saw what happened in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. And what's interesting, and linking it to Tony Blair, is the fact that what happened in Iraq, what happened in these places, even though it was all, you know, it was a lie and it's been proven that it was a lie, even still this guy is being given some top award recognition, right? But the point is, though, if you look at the statements that were made by the politicians at the time, it was all filled with the concept of we are protecting our freedoms. We are protecting our freedoms. We are spreading freedom to the women in the living under Taliban. We are spreading the freedom to X, Y, and Z. In 2009, for example, the George Bush, American president, he presented Tony Blair with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest US civilian honor. And what he said, this was for efforts to promote democracy, human rights, and peace abroad. Okay, so what we're seeing here again, Presidential Medal of Freedom. So this same concept of freedom is being applied and being forced down the throats of people around the world, and certainly in the Muslim lands, right? If you believe in freedom and you believe in the personal freedom, you believe in the freedom of religion, then why is it a problem that a Muslim woman wants to dress in a certain way, or Muslims want to live by the Sharia, which is, the guidance, which comes from their deen, which comes from their belief. Isn't that another hypocrisy? What do you think, Ishti?
I think there's a lot of hypocrisy that's being mentioned here. I mean, if you think about it, we're taught about Galileo for two reasons. A, about Earth, the planets going around the Earth and the universe and its position in the universe. But the other thing is the church repressed Galileo's ideas. They said it wasn't true. And they said the idea of freedom of expression, you should be able to express your ideas and discuss them. So out of that discussion, the correct idea will emerge. And that's why it's also always mentioned, not just in the terms of scientific idea, but the idea of the correct idea should be able to be presented, and not just the notion of one viewpoint. Fact that the fact that you can only hear the liberal viewpoint and not hear the other side, that I don't agree to this viewpoint, maybe this is better for you, this is the way God sees it, this is the way you were created. Not even to be able to teach that is extraordinary. And the fact that the hypocrisy is so clear is a joke. And the sad fact is, a while ago in the UK anyway, is when those people were protesting against those, I forgot what it's called, the teaching about LGBT for younger children.
In Birmingham.
It was all over the UK. It was in Batley, everywhere, wasn't it? But particularly Birmingham. The thing is, the issue is that people are speaking against it, and that's where they have the issue. And I cannot understand how they can be so bold to promote these ideas in other countries and yet not actually live by them in their own country. They're exporting something they don't believe in.
Would you not say that even Ishti, the sort of, I mean, I don't know whether you're pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, but the vaccine issue, would that come in? I mean, someone may say the harm principle, the fact that it's going to affect other people, but the fact that now it's a mindset that people who are not vaccinated choose not to be vaccinated. Somehow they're like pariahs of the state, and they look down upon. But isn't that shaping people's behavior and attitudes to other people? But shouldn't they be free to say, well, I don't want to have this vaccine?
It's definitely a social not that I'm not saying it might have been designed like this, but it's worked out as a bit of a social experiment, hasn't it? And if anybody wanted to prove that doing something like this could result in, like you've just described, some people detesting other people, even in their own families, and saying, don't come round to my house, etc., you wouldn't have believed that people would behave in the way that they've behaved since this. So again, and not even for sinister reasons. It's, just because the type of information that you're given, you're going to think that that person, if they aren't vaccinated, if they've got the virus, blah, 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 is going to threaten my health. Therefore, I need to be extra careful. So I understand it, but it's almost enacted as a social experiment because they've been able to control people's behavior via the vaccine, whether intentionally or otherwise.
Yeah, no, exactly, bro. And that's the thing. It's about shaping. And if you think about it, against Islam, they've been shaping people's behavior towards Islam for a long time. The fact that they've made it okay now to ridicule certain aspects of Islam is normal now. It's banter, right? Whether it's to do with the fact that, I mean, going back to the issue to the conversion therapy, just compare that to the fact where you're allowed to basically burn the Quran, you're allowed to insult and draw cartoons depicting the Messenger Sallallahu, and these can even be bloody, broadcasted around the world. They can even be projected on buildings, right? And when, like we did a podcast before, when Macron was depicted as Hitler, right? He tried to sue them. It's just so much hypocrisy. It's unbelievable. And just to add as well, sorry, Affy, I'll bring you in. I don't want to take it to someone else, but I'll bring you in if you want to make a point.
I was going to say, look, we could talk about the contradictions of what's in theory and what's in reality, but I think it's also linked to, and all these examples that you've given is linked to that basic question that you asked at the start, that are people enslaved to freedom? And however you want to define it, is irrelevant, because what's the definition of slavery, right? You're being told to do something, and if you don't, you'll get punished. And what is happening? The example of the vaccines that you've given, Muslims have to believe in a certain version of Islam, conversion therapy, which all shows that, look, these ideas that we're forcing you or indoctrinating you with from birth, let's be honest, because every institution that you're going to interact with from society, from all levels of the state, including the police who are there to enforce these ideas, are going to make sure that you are carrying a certain viewpoint and a certain version of these ideas that the government wants you, or the capitalists want you to adopt. And the moment you deviate, there's going to be punishment. So this is what enslavement is, isn't it? Yeah. So, you have to believe in a certain way. And there can be no challenging, not even on an intellectual level, because like what Rash was talking about, conversion therapy sets a precedent whereby this is a view that you've got to accept, the freedom of your sexuality, etc., etc. And, if you've got certain thoughts towards someone of the same gender, then this is good, you are homosexual. But the moment you want to have a discussion that actually, is this innate, or is this as a result of the environment that I'm in and the thoughts that I've generated, then that's illegal. Okay. So, you're allowed to insult Islam, but no one is actually placing you to, and they've made this acceptable, and in some places it's legal, like the hijab ban, which was actually enforced in Germany, I believe it was, through the European Court of Human Rights as well. So, this goes to show that you can adopt a certain version of freedom, which is actually the only version you could carry, but any more deviation from it or challenging what's being given to you, you're going to get in trouble. So, if people can claim that they are free, but that sounds an awful lot like slavery to me.
Yeah, and a point that's really important to make is, as Muslims, what we have to understand is that, when you see what's happening in Saudi at the moment, and we spoke about this in a previous podcast, that this is what they call freedom. This is them exporting freedom to the Muslim lands, right? And it's no coincidence that it's happening in Saudi. And the fact that they put a ban on, they put not a ban, but they've enforced measures within the haram to do with face masks and people being 2 meters apart, whatever. However, we only saw not longer, many weeks ago, I can't remember how recent it was, we had, a concert where 750,000 people attended. But when you look at some of the interviews, like, for example, when they was interviewing these people at this beach in Jeddah, which is not segregated anymore, what were they saying? Some people said, look, we used to have to travel to other countries to do this. Now we can do it here. We're free to do this, right? This is like Jannah, okay? So as Muslims, what we have to understand is that this filth that we are seeing, and I think what Ishti said at the beginning was fantastic, that, freedom comes at a cost. And what cost does it come to? Even in, just say, for people in the West, the Westerners, families are broken, right? Families are broken, right? The rates of like single parents and all this stuff, it's really, really bad when you dig deep. Just down the road from me, there's like food banks, right? And you would never have imagined, right, these things happening in Europe, certainly when you come from the subcontinent. So the point I'm saying, and the message to the Muslim listeners, is that, look, this is what they want to export, and they have been wanting to export to the Muslim lands, okay? And this is something which, as Muslims, everyone sort of has to be aware of, because, Allah forbid, what we're seeing here, if we start seeing in the Muslim lands, this would be a calamity, right? But I want to sort of bring something in that's really important and get you guys' thoughts. And I think it's only fair if we do this. We've spoken about freedom. We've spoken about how erroneous it is. We've spoken about how it doesn't exist. And we've spoken about how people are enslaved to the dunya and the whims and desires. Because all the things, whether it's personal freedoms and freedom of ownership, all these things really are linked to the dunya, right? In reality, right? Because even the issue of your religion, freedom of religion, you can believe or you can't believe, but it shouldn't really impact how you live your life. So the freedoms are linked to the dunya, right? However, as Muslims, what's the concept of freedom? And I think one thing that Affy mentioned, and I want to differentiate, the issue of freedom and the issue of free will is different. Okay, Affy, do you want to just elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think the freedom concept we've talked about. I think the free will bit is, we've all got the ability to make a choice in what we do. Whether as a Muslim, from a Muslim perspective, even in this society, we've got a choice of going out and stealing. We've got a choice of whether we, as a Muslim, whether we pray or not. And that is all down to this. And this free will is where, for us, accountability comes in, is because as a result of that choice that we're making, what do we do? Do we do it in line with the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or do we not? Comes a consequence. And then, as I say to everyone, you are free to do whatever you want. However, just be prepared for the consequences, because if you do it in the right way, the rewards will be great. If you do it in the wrong way, obviously the punishment is far worse. And I think Muslims have tried to, some people have tried to kind of find this compromise between the Western understanding of freedom and try and mix it with this concept of free will, to say, look, that's all these guys are saying, but I think it's different because, you've got a choice in what you do, and that is free will. But that is far different to what concept of freedom.
I think where people would see the difference clearly is if you were to speak to a Muslim and just say the example Rash gave about the personal freedoms, and you asked a Muslim, like, if your child came home and with just a guy, if your daughter came home with a guy and unashamedly just wanted to do whatever, right? Would you allow that? If your children, or somewhat simple, like if your children want to have tattoos, would you allow that? Would you allow your children to leave Islam? Would you allow your children to insult the Messenger or insult anyone? If you think about these freedoms from an Islamic point of view, we see that they are in total contradiction with Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us we are slaves of Allah, we are abd, right? And I think for Muslims, you're right. Even we start to use the word Islam gave these freedoms to women. Islam gave guidance, right? Islam said this is what you can do, what you can't do. This is the khair, this is the shar, okay? And I think we sometimes word it in a way so it's similar to what the West is saying, but if you break it down and you apply those freedoms in your own family, and you ask, would you allow your own members of your own family to practice these freedoms in the way they're promoting? They would say never. And I think that's for Muslims. I think that would really they'd be able to visualize what these freedoms really mean and how decadent they are.
And I think Muslims need. Sorry, Rash, go on.
No, sorry, you go ahead, bro.
I was going to say Muslims need to, and this is probably a theme that we've had in a number of podcasts that we've had in the past. I think Muslims need to have confidence in the beauty and the benefit that we've got of our deen and the fact that we've come across it, because it does solve man's problems and meets the needs of human nature in such an effective manner that it does actually give you true tranquility. And we, just because the propaganda machine and society, we know, especially in the West and now in the Muslim world, is propagating and attacking the sanctity of the Islamic belief, it does not mean that we need to be defensive. We need to fight back and have that confidence. Actually, this is the truth. Let's not talk about the benefit that this is going to give an individual on a particular action. Let's just go back to how you've arrived at what you believe, how I've arrived at what I believe, and let's see which one is correct and which has been more successful. And that's the crux of the discussion, because their freedoms are based on a number of erroneous concepts that they've not even thought about. They just arrived at it to push back to the church at, and therefore then evolve these concepts to maintain that status quo. Whereas actually our belief is based upon intellect, the greatest level of intellect, because we question everything about the universe. What's before it, what's after it, whether there is a God or not, and actually how do we prove that he has communicated with us? This isn't a compromise that we've arrived at, this is fact. So let's have that intellectual discussion. We've had it. We've got, if you look back to the lessons from Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, even through persecution, when was he ever on the back foot? Despite persecution, he stepped forward and challenged the persecutors with what they believed in. And therefore, we have to learn lessons from, he's the greatest example to mankind. He's our example. We need to follow those lessons, be confident, because the only way we're going to prevent that corruption from taking over us and the future generations is by standing firm and defending the idea of Islam and pushing back and attacking the incorrect ideas.
I was just going to say those are key takeaways, because what Islam and Islam can give evidence and from the reality and from history about this as well. So in terms of Affy saying, right, Islam doesn't sell a false dream. Islam says, this is what it is. These are your restrictions. This is the guidance. This is what you're allowed to do. This is what you're not allowed to do. Whereas the freedoms are kind of like, oh, look, they're false. They're flawed in themselves. You've got these freedoms. Look, you can do whatever you want, but you can't do this, you can't do that, or you can speak about, you can blaspheme again when it comes to Islam, but then you can't talk about Holocaust denial and stuff like that. So there's intrinsic hypocrisy in the freedoms that they present. Whereas Islam and its 1400-year history, or even the 1300 or so years when Islam existed as a full civilization, proves that even with those restrictions, man prospered. If they say that those freedoms of what has given human being, the freedoms of the last 100 years, if they say that that's actually given man happiness, tranquility, or progression, then that's completely false. But there's more people depressed today than there's ever been. There's more suicides than there's ever been. There's more, illegitimate children than there's ever been. There's so many things you can say have been the result of this flawed notion of freedom. Whereas you look at the Islamic civilization and we see prosperity. We didn't see all these wealth distribution issues. Even the likes of climate change and all of these things have happened off the back of the way the world has been, under this kind of, under freedoms in itself, what we see. So I think even if you speak to Muslims today, we have those restrictions on our lives that we recognize are from Islam, but are we not tranquil? Are we not happy? Just because if someone wants to say your freedoms have been restricted by Islam, well, I'm happy about that, because those restrictions are from my creator and he knows me better than anybody else. So I will take his restrictions and I will live by them, even if in one particular situation I might think, oh, I want to do that. I'm not going to do it because those restrictions are from my creator. So I think that's where the freedoms and the Western civilization, we're seeing fruits of that today, has completely failed. Whereas the history of Islam proves that when you have Islam at a personal and a societal and a governmental level, people and human beings and societies actually prosper.
Yeah. And you mentioned the word restriction a few times, but a thought came to my mind when you said that is, when we say restrictions, like Islam, Islam has restrictions, but we've already established that even the people living under freedom, there are restrictions.
They have restrictions, exactly.
Right? So there is no absolute freedom, and then you have Islam, which has restrictions, or other religions have restrictions. There is no such thing.
And you know what? Hikmah is a key thing here. It's easy for me or you or someone to say, you know what? The economy is suffering. 50% of the people are working, the men. 50% of the people are not working, the women. It seems logical just to say, you know what, if we get some of the women to work, then the economy is going to prosper, yeah? That's the limited akal of man going, you know what, let's send the women out to work as well, and all of a sudden, the economy is going to boom. But it's within Allah's hikmah and wisdom that the family structure needs to be held. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recognizes the role and the responsibility and the importance of the woman looking after the household, looking after the children, you know, nurturing the next generation and not having to be out there working. So we shouldn't be fearful of these feminists that try to, even Muslim ones, that try to say otherwise. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defined a role for women, and it's not the limited mind of man that can come along and just go, you know what, send everybody out to work, that will help the economy. It's just bogus, and it just exposes falsehood.
Yeah, no, definitely, bro. And the thing is, I think that what do they say? The proof is in the pudding. If freedom was so great, then why are the levels of depression and anxiety at record levels?
Exactly.
You know, you got to question that. But listen, inshallah ta'ala, I want to get your final thoughts on this topic and on the question and on the stuff we're discussing, inshallah ta'ala, and sort of bring the podcast to a close. Ishti, I'll start with you, bro. I know you had some stuff on your mind anyway, because I can tell always with your body signals and stuff. So if you want to mention something from before, that's fine. But if you want to, you know, maybe give some final thoughts on the topic we've discussed today.
Well, what I was going to say has been more eloquently put, so I'll leave that to a side. I think ultimately, from what we've discussed, I think it is important, because the Islamic creed starts with acknowledging our relationship with Allah, right? That accepting He exists, and then understanding He is the master and we are His servants. And in that servitude or slave, I don't know what the correct term is our greatest fulfillment, because fulfilling what Allah's obligations are, and you know, is our ultimate purpose. Whereas these freedoms are causing all sorts of issues, and it only creates joy for the people at the top. So I think that's where we've got to start. You've got to understand our position in the world and go from there. And I think Affy mentioned having confidence and that understanding of how that fulfills man's needs. And the term restriction, once you have that understanding, it doesn't feel like a restriction. It feels like you feel like happy that you've, achieved an aim, or you've stayed away from something that Allah hates or dislikes. So yeah, that's my point.
Yeah, and just quickly to add to that is, when you talk about you don't feel restricted, is because when you're submitting to the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in fact, you feel free, because you're free from the worship of man, you're free from the worship of the dunya, whims and desires, and you're submitting to your Lord. So within that itself, there's a freedom. Affy, bro, give us your thoughts.
I think just to build on probably what Ishti has just said, I think, one thing I would urge, and it's definitely helped me in arriving at the correct view about life and understanding, the beauty of Islam, or is visiting the Muslim countries, especially the poorer countries. And my experience is from the Arab countries, so that's what I'm going to focus on, especially Egypt, where people there are extremely poor. They're not chasing the dream. Here, we've fallen victim to perhaps some elements of the freedoms that we've talked about, and we're chasing that dream, that dream of freedom and ownership and having more. And we invest so much time in stocks and shares and mortgages to buy houses and cryptocurrency and, all this kind of Ponzi schemes that we fall victim to, all in the dream of becoming rich, where we should have the belief that actually one thing we know for a fact is our rizq is fixed. What's going to be for us, we're going to get anyway. And this chasing of that dream is what's going to make you miserable, because if it's not meant for you, you're not going to get it. Whereas, when you go to some of these countries like Egypt, you'll find people who are just working to get food on the table, and they understand this concept of rizq. They understand the concept of what is from Allah. This situation is from Allah Ta'ala, and for this I am going to be rewarded in the hereafter. And that makes them content. And you do see this happiness and this generosity and this hospitality from them, despite their poverty, because they know what's important and they know what this life is about.
Yeah, no, Jazakallah khair, bro. And obviously I've been there with you, and we definitely, I can definitely account for that. Brother Rash.
Yeah, just a couple of things, because I think we probably didn't touch on them. I'll try and keep all my points quite short. The Tony Blair one, That's an important one, because, you know, we need to recognize that what Britain and France and America, what they wanted to do is export these freedoms into our lands, and they continue to want to do that. And the Tony Blair example is a good one, because look at the fact that they're now, you know, putting him on a pedestal after what he's done. 1 million people marched against the Iraq war, and they still bombed the crap out of Iraq, and, you know, millions killed and many, many tens of millions people displaced, yet they're now giving him this award. My warning to Muslims, though, is, you know, those petitions you've talked about, I've had Muslims send me that petition. So what I would say to them is, firstly, we don't recognize these titles. Why do we care that, you know, why should I waste my time signing a petition? I don't recognize these titles that are being given out. In fact, we should look at that and laugh at the hypocrisy of these people that try and tell us that they're promoting freedoms and human rights. What kind of bullshit freedom, human rights means that you give the person who is responsible, or one of the people who are responsible for killing so many Muslims, what kind of human rights is to give that person an award? So we should speak to Muslims and go, this is their hypocrisy. This is what they truly believe. And people like Tony Blair are part of their deep state. These are decision makers, thinkers. You know, he's got like his own Institute for Change, a government, non-government organization. They promote feminism, democracy. They're involved in the, you know, the various programs about, you know, that resort in Islamophobia. So we need to be politically clued up about things like that, rather than the stupid thing of, oh, someone sent me a petition, I'm going to forward it on without thinking. So I think that's very important. In terms of conversion therapy, we might be thinking that, oh, okay, it's not such a big deal. We can deal with this within our communities. I would just say we need to be careful, because it won't take long before the schools start to go teach the children that, look, your parents aren't allowed to detract you from being what you want. Prepare your children early, because these things are coming. These things are genuinely coming, and they're getting faster and faster. And before you know it, there's going to be programs on TV saying that, look, people can't deter you from your sexuality. Schools are going to teach it. And then suddenly it will become harder for the parents. So prepare your children early. Yeah. Last couple of things is that there's a sick quote. You must have all heard it. You know, Noam Chomsky. There's loads of posters out there, and it's something that is very relevant to today's discussion. He said, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. Fits perfectly. They allow you to debate within a certain boundary, within those restrictions, and they then tell you you're free. That's where freedoms are completely, it's bogus. Even your freedom to speak your opinion is completely bogus, because when it comes to speaking about certain things, or even speaking about a different way of life, a different ideology, completely clamp down on it, whether through the media, whether through criminal, you know, whether through the legal system, all of these things. So, you know, we should be a bit more wary about that. And the very last one is, you know, restrictions aren't bad. What if the restriction is the barbed wire stopping you from falling into the hellfire? What about the Hadith when, we're just quickly paraphrasing it, about the hellfire is surrounded by difficulties? Those are restrictions. I'm happy to have those restrictions if it's going to stop me falling into that hellfire.
Yeah. No, Jazakallah, bro. And to be honest with you, from some of the stuff you said, I mean, I had a few points I wanted to make, but I'm going to add on very quickly some of the stuff you said. The restrictions that you just mentioned there, if you think about it, let's actually look into it. Islam does not restrict you from working. Islam does not restrict you from living a good life. Islam does not restrict you from having a relationship as long as it's with the niqah. And you more than one, right? You know, and here is, you know, it's all right for you to have affairs, but you can't get married twice, right? So in reality, if you really thought about it, what does Islam restrict you to do? In reality, is those things are evil anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. So within the things that are permissible, there is no restrictions in that respect, right? Another point I just want to add is that I was thinking when Affy was talking about the dreams, and something that Rash, you mentioned earlier, that they sell you this dream. That's what it is. And in fact, it's not a dream, it's a nightmare. Okay, they're calling it a dream. But you look at Islam, you look at surahs, for example, Surah Al-Haqqa, i.e. the inevitable reality, where it talks about that you'll be on that day and you'll be there and your book will be in your right hand and left hand and so on. The fact that the surah is called the inevitable reality is just telling you that you're definitely going to get your book in one of those hands. You're definitely going to be standing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that day, you're definitely going to be a winner or you're definitely going to be a loser. It's definite. Islam is not built on any dream. Islam is built on the haqq, it's built on the truth. And last point, I thought I'd finish with the hadith of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when we're talking about a society where you have this illusion of freedoms, that where people are enslaved by this concept of freedom, the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the similitude of those who maintain Allah's limits and those who transgress the limit is like those who share a boat. Some would occupy the lower deck while others the upper deck. The occupants of the lower deck would have to go to the upper deck to have access to the water. Those in the lower deck asked, why don't we drill a hole in the lower deck to directly access the water so as not to cause any inconvenience to those above us? If those on the upper deck allowed this to happen, then the entire boat with all its passengers would sink. However, if they prevented them from doing so, then all would be saved. And that hadith really encompasses the society that is obedient to the Creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where the relationships are managed according to this, and the society where people think that they can decide, that they are the gods, they think that they can decide what's right and wrong, and in reality, that society will collapse, and which we're seeing signs of it in our current life. But inshallah ta'ala, guys, really it's been a very interesting podcast, some great views. And as always, Jazakallah khair for coming on. Certainly with Ishti, he's not been well. So make dua, he's on recovery now, but it was very short notice, but really couldn't have done this without him. And for all those listening at home, as you know, you can access the Islamic Vibes podcast on all popular podcast platforms and also on my Path to Revival YouTube channel. And that is Path and the number 2 Revival, just in case you're having difficulties finding that page. So brothers, once again, Jazakallah khair for joining. And inshallah ta'ala, I'll see you on the next one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.